soldiers. This war has seen massive destruction and numerous civilian deaths and injuries in many areas of Ukraine. Ukraine's armed forces have been stretched again and again with repeated deployments for already battle-worn soldiers. New recruits have barely enough time to learn basic soldier skills. This is a war where there is no clear outcome, nor is there a foreseeable time frame for ending combat operations. While Ukraine's military is resilient, Western democracies need to remain committed to Ukraine's armed forces. Part of supporting soldiers in war is recognizing the importance of soldiers' relationships with their loved ones, in particular, relationships with spouses and intimate partners, those who also contribute in many ways to this war effort. Given the nature of this war and the challenges being faced by soldiers at the front and at home, we recognize the importance of supporting and sustaining these relationships. As the U.S. learned from its wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, even when the combat ends, soldiers and loved ones will continue to face many challenges in the transition back into civilian life. There is no doubt that many Ukrainian veterans and their loved ones are already confronting this reality. Our presenter today, Rachel Foster, is a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. Dr. Foster served 21 years on active duty in a variety of clinical research and leadership roles. Rachel is a combat veteran of our war in Afghanistan. Dr. Foster was the U.S. Air Force Surgeon General Advisor at our Pentagon Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office for more than 3 years, where she provided subject matter and clinical expertise in support of sexual assault victims. Currently, Dr. Foster is an instructor for the Global College of Professional Military Education, our Air Force University, and she continues to write and collaborate on topics related to family and sexual violence prevention. Here's Colonel Foster. Rachel, go ahead and please begin.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to everyone who's here today. A special thanks to Jim and Carl for your leadership and contributions and concern for not only American service members, but our brothers and sisters in arms in Ukraine. I also want to say thank you to Lieutenant Hukovsky, Oksana Bayar, and Chris Adams from the Center for Deployment Psychology, and certainly countless others who are helping in this effort to share information. So briefly, just here are my disclosures for today's briefing and presentation.
Ого. No.
So today we are talking about intimate partnerships and essentially family. My undergraduate work is psychology and family studies. And I love learning and love continue to learning about the system of family and how it works most optimally. And I bring that passion to today's presentation. And when we think about marital relationships, we know that, or intimate partner relationships, we know that relationships can at times be difficult. Marital relationships can be our greatest teachers, but war puts an incredible stressor on any relationship. And it can also serve as a mechanism to strengthen that relationships in ways it had not previously done. Some of my background to add on to Jim's comments, I had studied and have studied for over 15 years, meeting at least 3 times a year with a group where we would study Jungian psychology in addition to the non-ordinary states of consciousness that help serve and help drive and help understand human behavior in a deeper way. I mention it briefly here because it absolutely shapes and forms some of the comments that I make today in this brief time that we have together. So today I'll be talking about U.S. couples and the best practices that we have found, some of those that we have found here in the United States. And having deployed to Afghanistan, I was with two Army units, the 10th Mountain Division and the 173rd Airborne Division. And I was at a forward operating base, and we had about 5,000 people there. And then I was flown, usually by a Black Hawk helicopter or similar aircraft, and convoyed to combat outposts where there were soldiers and airmen, Marines, and seamen. And essentially what I learned during that time, and I was partnered at that time in a partnership, in an intimate partner relationship, but not yet married, that the experience of being separated from family and talking with individuals that I counseled during that time was particularly and certainly grueling in many ways, some of which I'll get into during today's presentation. I have just a tremendous amount of empathy for all of those in Ukraine, the families who are separated, and the soldiers and service members who are fighting in this war. I and my family think about all of you and pray for you. Pray for you and pray for Ukraine. The work I do for the Air Force, teaching research courses, they're from all the service branches in the United States. And I just want all of you to know that my students do write about and are writing about the Ukrainian warfighter. And most specifically, in one of my most recent classes, students talking about the Ukrainian warfighter and their strength, and specifically the use of common utility drones, not military drones that we think of, but just to the creativity of the Ukrainian warfighter to best deter and fight. My students are impressed with the ability of the Ukrainian service members and soldiers to react and outmaneuver Russian forces. Some of the presentation limitations, I just want to let you know there are some limitations to my presentation, one of which is that I do not have the ability to fully understand the cultural differences between the US and Ukraine. And so I will just focus on the culture here in the United States. And I hope that some of that work will be found to be helpful to all of you. And I do not discuss or consider single service members in the presentation whatsoever today, although I think it's certainly a topic within its own right to be discussed at some possible future seminar if it's considered important to do so. I will say too that the presentation is certainly derived, as Jim already mentioned, from wars that we have not fought on our own homeland. And so that is a presentation limitation that I am aware of. Certainly fighting a war on your own homeland is a different type of war. And I think there's a different emotional component that I fully cannot take into consideration today in this presentation, but I am aware of it. So the terminology that I will use largely is service member, but it does include soldiers and airmen and Marines, seamen, and certainly Coast Guardmen in terms of the America service members. And I also will use this terminology of combat and combat-related deployment. So when there are members who are deployed, certainly we have members who are fighting, they're on the front lines, and those individuals are fighting the war in the front. And then we have the combat-related roles. And my role when I was deployed in Afghanistan was as a combat-related airman. So thinking about the framework for the talk, I will mention some of the theoretical perspectives that go into the framework that I will discuss in today's short presentation. I will say that when I think about my own deployment, there's a story that that I consider comes back to me when I think about these combat and combat-related deployments. So when I was in Afghanistan with the Army, there was a time where, you know, here we are, we're in Afghanistan on the Logar province of Eastern Afghanistan, and it was dusk, and a mortar dropped into our fob. So I was actually at this time going into the command post, and there was an Army infantry soldier coming out of the command post. And so he and I both stopped. The mortar wasn't close enough to us that we had to take shelter, but there was a boom, it shook the ground, and it definitely got our attention. But he and I looked at one another. I noticed that he was smiling, and I noticed myself smiling too. And underneath his smile was fear. I saw this around the corners of his mouth and in his eyes. And as I observed my own smiling in fear in that moment, I said to him, you know, we are trained to pretend that what just happened is normal. It's not normal. Let's never forget that. It's okay for the both of us to feel our fear here. And in that moment, as I looked at him in his eyes and he looked at me, he looked relieved. No one was hurt in that scenario. I'm so relieved to say that. No one was hurt. But it's a memory I hold with me and that stays with me. War is complicated. Trying to survive war is complicated. And trying to come home to our partners or spouses, families, amidst and after our deployment is complicated. And I'll do my best to talk about that here. When we think about families, families are complicated, and family systems theory is really just the interplay among these family systems, the emotional fusion, the differentiation of parts in this family system. And Murray Bowen's theory helps us to just understand how these family systems operate or don't operate well. The ecological systems theory, Yuri Bronfenbrenner's theory, takes into account a person in their environment and the different levels of systems in that environment. The microsystem, the mesosystem, and the macrosystem are most commonly thought of and talked about, but there's also the exosystem and chronosystem. These systems influence and shape the support that individuals and groups and families experience, and it influences strongly their level of functioning and their ability to function well. And lastly, but definitely not least, attachment theory. And we think about attachment theory as it connects to couples and relationships and our intimate partners, and that distancer and pursuer dynamic that's a part of any attachment. Now, John Bowlby's attachment theory is largely shaped around primary caregivers and that response to the infant or a child as they develop. I spent over a year and a half at Duke observing and participating in the strange situation laboratory procedure that is a part of attachment theory, and working with children and seeing them and how they respond in situations where they are stressed, and how that child can respond or not respond in that relationship with their primary caregiver, largely their mother. And I mention attachment theory today because it goes into and feeds into the relationship that we have with our spouse or our intimate partner. And for all of you listening today and hearing this presentation, that dynamic, you'll see that dynamic and that interplay between an intimate partner and the concern for an intimate partner come through even during wartime environments. So during my deployment, as I would work with service members, I would see their concern, their longing for their family, for their spouse, their intimate partner, and certainly their children. And during the different phases of deployment, you'll see, which I'll talk about in a moment, we'll see here how certainly at different phases of a deployment cycle, there's a different level of stress that gets introduced into this family system that we always want to make sure that we're aware of and that we pay close attention to as clinicians and mental health providers. So I want to emphasize here too that when we're looking at or considering life or death situations, how couples get their needs met at the most basic levels during war may possibly be different and may not be fully explained or understood to the service member during that incredible amount of stress. But these theories do provide a framework for what all of us are doing in our clinical work with service members. And I'll do my best here to talk a little bit more about it. So this photo is from a story I first heard on National Public Radio in the US on Valentine's Day, February 14th of this year. And I'll briefly mention part of the story. So here it goes. A week before Valentine's Day, Ina Yermolovich and Yulia Dmitrieva booked train tickets from Ukraine's capital, Kiev, to the east, where they will meet their husbands, soldiers who serve in the same unit. On this day, we usually expect presents and flowers, cards and hearts, says Ina, a 30-year-old import manager and hat maker. Not this year. She and her husband, Dima, are newlyweds. She hasn't seen him for a month. Seeing him for even a couple days, she says, recharges me. It's amazing, these moments, she says. I enjoy how he's drinking tea, or how he's putting on his shoes, or how he's moving just to see his breathing. And another couple, Yulia and her husband Vadim, have been together for almost 14 years. He's incredible, says Eula, who's 49, who works in IT and has red tinted dreadlocks. He's creative and he makes people around him happy. The women board a train headed to the Donetsk region where the war's fiercest fighting is going on. It's filled with the partners of soldiers fighting there. That route that starts in Kiev and ends in the city of Kramatorsk is sometimes called the Train of Love. Ina and Yulia are due to get off the train's second to last stop. Ina's husband, Dima, arrives first. And the story goes on. Yes, this is a romanticized story of war. And we know that the preparation for war is just not always like this. But I share the story as a backdrop to a larger conversation on what couples experience and how they relate during the time of war. Further, and we know that not all the stories as depicted in the story here told by American reporters does not even scratch the surface of the difficulty of war, the challenge of war, and how it impacts individuals and those relationships of immediate family and extended family. Again, what the story actually represents, and if you decide to listen to the story at any point, as it's on the open net, it represents the range of experiences that couples have when going and coming from war. So when we think about in the United States largely focuses on and considers, as depicted here, is a common guideline or representation of the phases of a deployment. But before we get into the specifics and the best tools and shared practices for military couples, I know from my own experience going to Afghanistan, again, I was partnered, but at the time not yet married, reading about the stages of military deployment helped me normalize my own experiences. Most commonly, fear of the unknown, questions about death. Am I going to die? Or what if I die? And real concerns I had about how I might be different after I returned from my combat-related deployment. Of course, nothing could prepare me as I prepared for war to the experiences of being on a Black Hawk and going out to a combat outpost as I was carrying my 70 pounds of gear, my 2 weapons, etc., to have to be preparing and thinking about what if this helicopter gets shot down? What am I going to do? Luckily, I had over 2 months of preparation at Fort Dix. I was part of the ADVON team, and so the Advanced Echelon team, and had lots of preparation to know how to survive a potential situation like this. But I mention my experience because when a service member receives notification of a deployment, it can send, and it generally does send, a wave of uncertainty or even bracing for that separation. As I've previously mentioned, consciously or unconsciously, members of the family start to process the separation. And when considering the work of Sue Johnson, who developed emotional focus therapy, who in fact she just passed away on April 23rd of this year, in which couples work at providing one another in the context of their relationship with a deep sense of security. Of course, the system of security gets intrinsically disrupted during a time of war because of the very real elements of possible death and loss. as I said, at the most fundamental level, how is the deployed service member in particular going to get his or her needs met? And what anxiety may this cause the family or other members who are at home? For someone deploying, it is really important for them to know what stage of deployment they're in. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment when I look at or talk about Morton Ender's work, who's a professor at the Department of Sociology at West Point. But I just want to pause here for a moment for questions to see if there are any questions from the audience. Okay. Hearing no questions come in, I will move on. So in this slide, you'll read about one view of a soldier's wife as it relates to her experience of preparing for deployment alongside her husband during the war in Iraq. This work or interview from Morton Ender, as I just mentioned, who's a professor at West Point, really encapsulates the voice of many and certainly many spouses who are preparing for a deployment alongside their service member, their soldier. And I'll just go ahead and read what she says. I just have to read it because it absolutely is something that is felt by many. I think pre-deployment, honestly, was the hardest part. I think the build up to him leaving was the worst. I was actually talking to another spouse about that last night. That was the absolute worst. The kind of not knowing, you know, doubting yourself and fearing for what was to come. And, you know, obviously there's some fear and things like that. Just the whole. I'm going to have to be everything to everyone. And feeling how I didn't know if I can handle it and didn't know. I mean, this is his first deployment and he's never been away for more than 2 months. I guess before, the pre-deployment is the hardest. So I mean this is, you know, a major thing for us, you know? And she's right. This is a major thing. War is a major thing. So in this slide, you'll see that Morton Ender's work, some of his work, which is from his larger body of work, he talks about here, and it's shown that the stages of deployment, and from the vast amount of interviews that he conducted with soldiers and soldiers' wives, and these interviews, is that the pre-deployment is very stressful. It's the second most stressful time during a deployment, or that separation. And of course, the deployment, and with no surprise, is the most stressful time during a deployment. Knowing the stages of deployment is critical because it provides anticipation for the family, for the people who are left behind, and for the service member. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the best practices. So here are the best practices that I'll go over.
То, что я тебе говорила, как типа тема на исцеление звука. Ну,
And some of the best practices for spouses overlap with what the soldiers will also be experiencing and the service members. But even amidst the overlap, there are some distinctions. And so I'll do my best to discuss those elements here. So in terms of communication, communication clearly is much different than it was even 20 years ago. The ability to communicate with and stay in communication with the family for a service member and for the spouse to be able to communicate with the spouse who's deployed or the intimate partner is complicated. The family system certainly functions, the American military family support system on every, Air Force, Army, every military installation. There's a function within the American militaries that helps support military families and military spouses. And this function within the military is critical to helping that family system stay as whole as possible during this incredible separation and incredible stress. So when we think about this communication with partners and our spouses, one element that's really important to focus on and to be thinking about for the spouse in particular is what to share, what not to share, and how often. And a conversation about these elements, about what to discuss and what not to discuss, is very, very helpful. I would say that without any reservation, that when the spouse who's left behind has their day-to-day life that they are trying to manage, potentially with children or without children, there are these elements of day-to-day life. For example, the basic things, maybe the car breaks down or the washing machine isn't working anymore. And these little frustrations, which for the spouse and the family can seem so challenging or so difficult, may in fact be almost too difficult really for the spouse who's deployed to even manage, problem solving, because they're focused on their basic needs, and that basic need is survival. And so any opportunity for the spouse who is at home, and I have to be thinking, my heart just goes out to all of the Ukrainian families who are separated so far. They're in other countries now. They're not in their homeland. And as I thought about the presentation, but even just hearing and reading about all of the separation that's going on for Ukrainian families, my heart is just so pulled, because I think about how can they even communicate? What is the communication like? I know a little bit about what's happening. So I offer this from the position of, really, I understand that I do not know what's going on in terms of the complications for the separations for the families in Ukraine. But what I do know and what I can offer is that any opportunity to discuss communication prior to a deployment, or even amidst the deployment, so the service member coming back and having some dwell time, or they have rest time, to be able to really set boundaries about what's realistic and what's helpful or not helpful is extremely, extremely important. And really, the spouse at home has that opportunity to really control that communication. And when I say control, I mean to really be mindful in a mindful way about what's being shared, because the service member has to be taken care of in a different way to preserve their own wellness during that period of time. And what I want to really offer here too is just from work that's been done by American researchers, is that Carney and Crohn's work and other work, similar work, is that despite the enduring interest in the effects on deployment of military families, to date, there's just really little consistent evidence that being deployed increases the risk of divorce. Just overwhelmingly, that's the pervasive understanding. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few moments. One other element of best practices to consider is this locus of control, right? And how do I find control when I have very little or no control? And so one piece that I learned when I was preparing for my deployment that I shared with my partner at the time was, just do not rely on news sources, and try to avoid them in terms of considering what's going on for me when I'm in Afghanistan. Because we don't know exactly, you will not know exactly what's going on with me. And to trust what's going on in the news may actually cause more stress for you. And so how that was helpful was to take on the idea, and part of that, obviously, I learned in my pre-deployment. I had to go to pre-deployment training, and so I learned that I should share that with my family. And not only did I share it with my partner, I shared it with my extended family, and it was very helpful to them. I found, of course, when I returned to that little piece of advice, here's what I can control. And what I can control is my own awareness of what's happening, and that what I learned from the news may or may not be true, right? And so I have to rely on my own understanding and not necessarily what I hear in the news, as it may relate to my husband or to my wife or my partner that's deployed. So the locus of control is critical, and really relying on potentially this quote or understanding that no news is good news, right? So not hearing, the absence of hearing something does not mean that something is wrong. And it's certainly something that helps people maintain and retain that locus of control. So another element for spouses or partners in particular is to really rely on social support. So how are spouses finding social support wherever they are, and informally or formally? Now, as I said, in the Americas, every installation has a family support center or some other center where spouses can get information and find support during this deployment time. And there are other efforts, informal and formal, deployed spouses dinners, and these other opportunities to connect, because it is critical to be connecting with people that understand your experience. And for a spouse or a partner, having that connection is critical. As we know, when we are around people that are having the same struggles and the same experiences that we are, it helps us to feel connected, to feel more normal, and to avoid being alone with our experience, because there are huge emotions that come with a wartime scenario, and a wartime scenario where our loved ones are where we're separated from them. So I'm going to take a moment here and pause for questions to see if there are any questions for me.
Можна?
Наталії можна. Давайте так.
Угу. Так, тут Рейчел озвучила на слайді про групи підтримки під час розгортання, які організовані військовими лідерами, да, я так зрозуміла. Чи можете трошки більше розказати, якщо це доречно в цій зустрічі або, можливо, в наступних, як це організовується, тобто хто за це відповідає, як це організовується, в які моменти? Дякую.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. So the groups, thank you so much for the question. And the way the groups are organized, there are generally two ways the groups are organized. The unit of the military organizes something formal that can happen, for example, in the city, it's for us, it happens on the installation, right? And so there's a place that's designated for people to gather, and the military unit organizes that. They're in charge. Okay. And so the other way that happens is through a spouse support group, right? So spouses have support groups, or they have a spouse, the spouses, it's a spouse deployed group, essentially. That's a common name that's used, or the spouses group. And those spouses organize that group. So those are two formal ways that those groups get organized. And so thinking about who leads that group, so depending on the form, how formal the group is, usually when a unit, or the Army unit or the Air Force unit, etc., organizes the group and the unit is in charge, there will be other helping services from that installation that come in. So this could be, people from our examples, the Family Support Center. There will be mental health providers there, and there'll be other, we call them like community partners, that come in and offer services. And really, it's an opportunity to provide like an informal discussion, right? To let people know they're connected to services. And when it happens through, a spouses group, the spouse group does something similar, but it may be more focused on sort of like helping services. For example, the spouses groups may just talk about kind of ways they're coping, right? And it may not be as formalized. Thank you for the question.
Дякую дуже. Дякую.
Are there any other questions?
There is a question in the chat, Rachel. Should I read
Okay.
it?
Yes, please.
Is there a special
Можна
program
ще
for
одне
such
запитання,
groups?
да?
прошу. Давайте зараз тоді це вже оголосила я, добре. Is there a special program for such groups? Дмитро, і потім ви тоді будете, добре?
Is there a special program for such groups?
Exactly.
I see. Well, yes, there is a special program. It is a special program and it's set up as a special program. So for example, I know, and it varies between different services in the United States among the military services. So I won't go into all of those differences, but it's formally set up and different people are in charge of it depending on the service. And what I'll say, just as I'm thinking about it just for a second longer, is that really, when I'm thinking about, I just have to put myself in terms of what the war in Ukraine. And I don't know everything that's going on over there, but as I've thought about it and contemplated what's happening, what I know is that that the Ukrainian mental health providers or other service organizations there can work together. And I did spend part of my graduate training, just a little bit of time in Romania, helping to set up social service agencies there. And in that work, as I was thinking about the presentation, just that one person, right, that wants to set up this helping organization can do that. And all it takes is that one person. And that's I just want to really convey that. It just takes that one person who wants to organize that and set that up. And it can be really powerful in many ways because in particular, obviously with technology, right, you can use technology if it's available to really connect large groups of people, even small groups of people, but even, just to bring lots of people together in a way that can be very meaningful and impactful. Thank you for the question.
Тут ще є продовження. Дмитро, давайте ви поставите питання, і потім, Карина, ми ваше друге питання прочитаємо.
Ще запитання можна задати?
Давайте.
Yes.
Специфіка війни в Україні в тому, що у нас військовослужбовці знаходяться на нулі, але при цьому їх родини також приймають участь у війні, тому що Росія обстрілює цивільні міста. Тобто родина опиняється на війні уся. Тобто і є відповідно до цього і просто інтенсивність різна. І до цієї війни ніхто не готувався з цивільних. І тому у мене питання, чи є практики, які стосуються якраз, найкращі практики, які стосуються якраз роботи з родинами, які знаходяться безпосередньо у містах, в які прилітають ракети, і як з дружинами або чоловіками в таких випадках організовувати групи? Дякую.
Sure. Yeah. And, I have to say, thank you for the question. I'll do my best to answer it. In preparing for the talk, and I was talking with my husband just about the nature of war in Ukraine and the experiences that you just described, and how to bring some regularity, some sense of peace, some sense of, non-reactivity. I don't know if I have a perfect answer for your really important question, but what I will say about it, having thought about your circumstances in a deep way, that what I would offer is in whatever way you can to formalize and take that step to formalize some, if you can, some regular meeting or meeting group, which I know is easy for me to probably say from here where I sit safely, you know, in my home in the United States. But I would really, any opportunity for that regular meeting, if there's an opportunity for that to get together and share and be with one another, that is what I would say. I think that is really no different than the practices, the best practices of what we have found in the United States. The difference is that you are being attacked on your, you know, on your own, in your homeland. And nothing that I will talk with today can fully compare to what you're experiencing. And so, again, any opportunity to bring together people in your cities in a place that that's commonly agreed upon is encouraged if those if those involved feel safe doing that, and there's a mechanism to make that happen, meaning a communication, a safe communication opportunity to do that. And I appreciate the question. I wish I could answer it better than I just did. I appreciate you sharing that. For
Rachel?
time's sake, yes.
Rachel, can I just make a very brief comment as a
Yeah.
follow-on?
Absolutely.
Oksana, we had a presentation maybe almost a year ago now by Lisa Bora at the University of Texas in Austin in the United States, who is the director of a large family support program, nonprofit program in the US. And we know that there are programs that have begun to develop in Ukraine. And I hope that there's some way of maybe highlighting them in one of these presentations in the future. I know there are organizations that spouses have developed. I know they have also developed some support programs for widows of service members who, and widows and widowers of service members who have been killed in Ukraine. And again, there may be some way that we can, you know, further highlight some of that. The only other comment I would make about the issues that are occurring in your cities and areas that are under attack, actually, there's a lot that we know from disaster mental health research that may be very applicable. And again, Kyle and I can think about that a little bit and see if there are some things that we can bring you in the future. Go ahead and continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. And I want to say thank you for all of the questions. I'll move along and we'll still have time for more questions as we move along. So in terms of thinking about connection from the spouses to their soldier or to their service member, to really just be thinking about any opportunity to be able to connect other than through direct communication through a phone, for example. Communication through a phone and texting, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But even just a letter or a note, and if care packages can be sent, if that is possible in your situation, then do that, because that is, you know, an opportunity to connect in a way that the service member, the soldier, doesn't have to necessarily respond, right? There doesn't necessarily have to be an immediate response. And it's something that that service member can carry with them, right? If there's a letter, you know, they can put it in their pocket. They can put it in their pack when they're traveling, and they can safely protect it. And what it becomes for that, for the person deployed, and fighting in the war is it really becomes this anchor. It becomes something that they'll hold on to, that they can really feel like they're holding on to in their heart. And any opportunity to connect in ways that are sort of non-electronic are very critical to soldiers and to service members. I'll mention children really briefly here because I know there will be at some point another training or presentation on the needs of children during a time of war. But I could not mention it in today's presentation because many of those who are deployed, many of those who fight in our wars do have children. And what I'll briefly mention here in terms of children of service members is that news sources and the showing of news sources to children, unless they're a little bit older, 15, 16, 17 and above, just a little bit older, they have more emotional maturity, more understanding. They can understand that separation of the parent. They have a little more understanding of what war is and why war is happening. Younger children may not have that capability. They won't have that capability, may not fully have that capability depending on their age. And especially for the, little children in particular who, are under, 18 months of age, who do not have object permanence, they do not know, they cannot see what's not there. They don't have an understanding of it, a recall of it. It's not there if it's not there, in other words. To really, with those children, to really any opportunity to connect through pictures like of their dad or their mom, to make that connection through a picture so they have that recall of that person, and that the communication and the love around that person being absent is extremely critical for children, and to be able to have that sort of healthy connection and that healthy awareness. I think that, again, more will be discussed at future presentations regarding children in terms of best practices for service members. I will say that without a doubt, knowing so many children who, I would say knowing so many children who've been through different separate lengths of separation from their dad or mom during wartime engagements, that children are very resilient and they have a lot of capabilities and capacities to adapt just like adults do. And the family that's at home, we're relying on them to provide that secure base, that secure environment, as much as they're capable of doing that, to help provide that psychological safety for children, for their child, and for the children. So when we're thinking about deployed members and communicating, I just want to mention briefly, and this reference is mentioned, listed in the resources at the end of the presentation, that, in Sullivan et al.'s work, one potential useful strategy may be to increase efforts to engage in communication that is likely to be perceived positively and to match or even exceed the time spent in conversations that are likely to be perceived negatively. So unpacking that, what that means is, and I really want to say this, because the spouse's job, who or the intimate partner who's at home, their job is just different than the person who's deployed, right? The person who's deployed has to be very focused on what's going on in their work there. But the roles are different, and optimal communication about what is helpful to be discussed and what is not helpful to be discussed is critical. The rapid communication that's available, in particular in 2024, and people being able to stay connected depending on if they have a cell phone or not, is something to keep in mind when communicating what is important to communicate about and what's not helpful. I had that capability of rapid communication when I was in Afghanistan with my family at home, but I elected not to participate in that rapid communication. In other words, I elected not to bring a cell phone with me where I could be in constant communication with my family. I may have made a different choice if I at that time had children. I don't know the answer to that. I probably would. I may have. It's hard for me to know. I probably would have, because I would have wanted to stay in communication with my child. But with my partner at the time, I was just very clear that I knew that would not be helpful to me to have rapid communication, to be available anytime. And so I said that, and I did not bring a cell phone. And so I relied on having communication, a phone on the forward operating base, or when I was out on mission at a combat outpost. And I relied on that communication working, and sometimes it didn't work. But I said clearly, I'll try and call you. I think it was on Wednesdays and Sundays. And if I don't call, don't be worried. And there were times I was not able to call on the days and times that I said I would call, because there would be a blackout in communication, right? For security reasons, for example, or I would get out to the combat outpost that usually had, reliable communication, and for whatever reason, the day that I was there, they didn't. And so what that allowed me to do is to have a little bit of control in a situation where I didn't have a lot of control, and also let my partner know that there's, if you don't hear from me, do not worry. I don't want you to worry if you do not hear from me. Just no news is good news unless you hear from me otherwise. And this, for me, provided some opportunity to, it provided both of us to really have some boundaries around what was happening, so we could take care of the things that we both needed to take care of. For me, it was taking care of the service members that I was working with clinically, working with at the combat stress clinic or out on my deployment. And for my partner, it was, taking care of things at home, which, as we know, there are a lot of things to continue to take care of when our family member is deployed. Things don't stop at home. In other words, when the person's deployed, things continue at home. And part of that knowing is one of my favorite teachers along my path in my training always taught me about this term, control brings freedom. So when we think about the locus of control for someone who's deployed, and they're deployed, there are only so many things that they control. They're not thinking about, or hopefully they're not thinking about, the bills, what bills need to be paid, right? Or these other, sort of complicated things that go on at home. They are focused on the mission, right? They are in any way possible to help them completely stay focused as much as is possible on the mission at hand, depending on whatever their job is. And so that locus of control brings freedom. When I know what I control, if I know what I can control, then I'm more in control. And I have my sense of agency, my internal agency, my internal locus of control. I am generally doing a lot better. I can function at a better level, and I can be more available in my unit, right, with my fellow soldiers, my fellow airmen, my fellow service members, in doing whatever task it is that we need to do and that we need to complete that day or that evening as part of the mission, whatever's happening in terms of the mission requirements. So this other piece around being aware of limitations. So when someone is deployed, they will, without a doubt, if they haven't already, they will have a further understanding of their limitations, whether it be physical limitations or psychological limitations. And this reflection for the service member on what they are good at and what they're not good at becomes clear very quickly. And they rely on their buddies or their fellow service members. And I'll talk about battle buddies in a moment, but it becomes exceptionally clear. And what service members, as I think about the soldiers who are on the front lines, in Ukraine, and I think about the writings of my own students, within the last 2 months from my own instructing that I do through Air University here in the United States, I know that those Ukrainian soldiers are so capable. And because I'm reading about it from my own students, aside from what I'm hearing in the news from American news sources. And what I just want to convey is that when you're working with these deployed service members, it is really okay for them to be communicating about what their limitations are, what they're finding limiting about their experience. And what I know to be true from having been in that experience and working with people so closely when they were deployed is that just being able to communicate about those difficulties provided great relief, extreme relief, just to be able to communicate about what they were struggling with. And it was like, you think of a balloon, and you just let that air out of the balloon, just to be able to have that communication, just letting that air out of the balloon, just the release of talking about what it is to feel those limitations in this extremely stressful and constrained environment. And this battle buddy, this is why the battle buddies are really important, because in the battle buddy program is a concept and program developed in the United States by the US Army. And in my opinion, it's one of the best programs the Army built because the purpose of the battle buddy program is that each battle buddy is expected to help their assigned, soldier, their fellow soldier, in and out of combat. And so battle buddies get assigned, and having that social support of that battle buddy really does two things. One, you have to be able to rely on your fellow soldier when you are deployed, and that strength of that team, right, that's developed is a social support, but you can also help finesse and understand better one's individual strengths and weaknesses, and be very clear about that. Know what you're good at, know what you're not good at, and relying on your buddy to help you during this time of war I don't want to say anything more about it because I cannot do it justice. Quite frankly, it is so critical to getting for the soldiers getting through what they're getting through. I just can't do it justice. So I'll leave that part there, and then just talk about the service members' role in communicating back home. We already talked about electronic communication and the role of electronic communication through phone, texting, certainly emails, if that's available. But, you know, if a service member has that opportunity to write a letter home and the capability infrastructures available to do that, to get the letter, you know, to the equivalent post office, to get that letter home, do that. Because the people who are back home will hold on to that. When I was deployed over Christmas time, and what we did in my FOB, we came up with this idea because we didn't want people feeling like they could only come to us if they had a problem, right? So we wanted to create opportunities for people to come and see the mental health provider when it was just other than having a problem, right? Because people would avoid us, right? If they thought they could only talk to the mental health provider when they had a problem, we were missing out on a good part of the population on the forward operating base or on the combat outpost who may not come and talk with us. So we set up a program where people could record stories and read them to their children. And we were able to electronically record that and put it on a disc. At the time it was a disc, you know, and because we didn't have USBs when we were deployed, but it was at a critical time where some people were still using combat discs, you know, and I don't know if people are still using CDs or not. I don't think they are very much, but at the time, it was that critical time where people were still using these, and we would record. These children would go in. We had a room in our tent, and we set it up, and we had different books, and they could choose the books, and they would record the story, and then we would burn that onto the disc, and we would mail it to the family. And, you know, and thinking about how we set that program up, we had really none of the resources for this where we were, but where I was on the small FOB, we were able to, I was able to communicate with some groups. I was able to connect with a few groups back in the United States at the time, and they sent some supplies to us at the FOB. And I had the computer, so I was able to work the electronics and the technology on my end that way. And I did have a recording device. Now all the smartphones have a recording device for the most part. But I mention this, it may or may not fit your particular scenario, but I mention it only in relation to creating those opportunities where the service member can send something home tangible from wherever they are, if the time allows for it. From what I understand from reading online, sometimes the deployment activity back and forth may not allow for the dwell time when the soldier is not on the front lines in Ukraine and then they're back recovering. It may not allow for this opportunity to communicate back home. But if there's any opportunity in terms of something written instead of just spoken or through a text, that's highly, highly encouraged. So I'm going to just sort of close here. And one thing that's been on my heart as I prepared for the presentation was just thinking about the deployment. And when I was leaving Afghanistan and I was with the 173rd Airborne Division, I had an opportunity. They asked me to share some comments that we were with I was with the forward surgical team and the other medics who were part of the brigade there, the 173rd. And I had one other mental health counterpart there, and he was the brigade psychologist. But they asked me to provide comments as we were leaving. And so one thing that kind of stayed with me that I'll share with you, and I hope it's helpful, is that what I said at the time, and I'll share it now, is that that during the most difficult times of my deployment, I did my best to focus on the values of service, duty, honor, country. And for medics and for people who are in combat-related roles, and mental health professionals who are on ground or who are back home, our duty is to help the hurting. Our honor is to serve those who sacrifice so much. And our country is our set of values that absolutely believes in freedom and peace. And for people who are listening to this today or at another time, just remember that your job is a noble one and your sacrifice worthy. My heart is with you. My family prays for Ukraine, the country, and all of its citizens. And at the times that you may feel alone, I just want you to know you are not alone. So many people are with you, and in this moment I'm with you, and I that will not fade, that will not stop. That's all I have, and I'm here for any other questions.
Дякуємо, Рейчел. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. Я бачу, що Карина, ви повернулись. У вас було ще друге питання, то, можливо, ви його особисто поставте. Я бачу, ви вже навіть і камеру увімкнули, так? Прошу.
Да, дуже дякую. В мене просто розрядився ноутбук, і я мала змінити цей. Thank you so much for this lecture, Rachel. That was like, at some moments I was like almost crying when you was talking about how couples are meeting, and like, yeah, that was like so touching. I wanted to ask that if I'm right in understanding you, that in the, like, I think in the middle of the presentation, you said that you should talk about like what we are not talking. And am I right that it was like a recommendation before the deployment of the soldier to discuss what information can't be shared for security reasons? Or is it just like sensitive topics that soldiers don't want to share, like I know, some like emotional, like personal topics they don't want to talk? Or is it both? Am I right? Did I understand you right?
Yes, I'm so glad. Thank you so much for this question. And you're absolutely right that there are two parts to it. There's the part of, there are things that I can't share because of security reasons, and that I'm not allowed to share. And so there are things that I can't share because of those security reasons. And then there are these other emotional boundaries that I want to try and set to help take care of myself while I'm deployed, and these are things that I need to do for my preservation of self, and that there's a conversation, the service member has the soldier has a conversation about it. You're exactly right. And just to say a little bit more about it, because it's going to be different for each in terms of the emotional part, the boundary part, certainly what we're told as military members, what we can't share, right? That's pretty clear cut, right? That's cut and dry. It's pretty clear cut what we can and can't share. But in terms of emotionally, what is going to be best for us to talk about or not talk about, that is very personal and individual.
Thank you so much. And like, if I can ask another question, or I should
Sure.
wait for.
No,
Okay,
please.
thank you. You in the end, you said that like it's helpful for the soldiers to remember what are we serving for, those values, keep them in mind. It is actually belief, but I see that a lot of soldiers in Ukraine, they are kind of disappointed, and they say that they don't believe in those values anymore, and they say that I don't like. I just want it to be over, or I just want to live my normal life. That's it. I don't want any of those, like, I don't know, like values and things I believed in when I was joining the army. Do you think we can affect it somehow, or the only thing can help them is a rotation, and they, as they already deserve, definitely just have to come back to their civil life and just have rest?
Yes, I mean, I think that there are a couple of thoughts I have about it, and then if you know, Jim and if Carl's still on, if they want to respond to, I'm open to that. But what is clear is, and I know, as Jim started out with, and what I've read here from the news sources I'm reading in the United States, that there's no definite end of the war here, and that the Ukrainian soldiers, a couple things are going on that, certainly there are people that could have fought, that have fled the country. And so there's an incredible pressure put on individuals that have stayed in the country to fight and to be part of the war. And so they're tired, they're tired. And so if someone expresses that, and I would call that potentially not being one-on-one with a person right now, but I would know that they were tired. And let's just face it, ambivalence is part of any major psychological process, especially one related to war, and especially for people who are on the front lines, having this incredibly beyond words, difficult experience, to be able to give a rotation, to get them some rest, and to normalize their experience. That yes, that is completely normal, and understanding that you're having doubts. This is more than anyone could have even prepared for or ever imagined. How could anyone prepare for this? Of course you'd feel like that. Of course. And those are my initial thoughts. And just to say one more thing about it, and then I'll see if Jim has anything else to say, is that I would say that even, reflecting on my conversations with American service members, that is something that even came about in the work that I did there, and people would have, a little bit, they would have breaks, they would have breaks in between. Their deployment cycles allowed for a little bit longer breaks during their dwell time. So it's completely understandable that people are expressing that fatigue.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's just that I was hopeful that as a psychologist, I can affect it at least a little bit, but seems like it's just that when the person needs to rest, they just have to rest.
That's right. That's exactly right. Thank you for the question. Are there other questions?
Я тоді пропоную дати слово учасниці нашої команди, яка збирала і систематизувала питання з реєстраційної форми. Ми будемо тоді чергувати, шановна аудиторія. Буде тоді Ольга ставити одне з таких питань, добре, і потім ми будемо давати слово одному із учасників і слухачів. Оля, прошу.
Дякую, добрий вечір. Питання таке: чи проходили американські військові психологічну реабілітацію після бойових дій перед тим, як повернутися в сім'ю? Чи вона була окрема для чоловіків і для їхніх партнерів, чи спільна, якщо була?
Sure. So generally, when there's the post-deployment phase, so when people are reintegrating back into their life, there's an opportunity. There's a reintegration phase, and different units do it a little bit differently. But I'll just generally talk about how it's done, where they have a short amount of time. The time can vary. I mean, sometimes it's 72 hours, sometimes it's up to 2 weeks, where they are processing what's happening before they are evaluated in some way. And so there's a questionnaire given, a post-deployment questionnaire, and there are questions, asking about physical, potential problems, psychological questions about wellness and functioning, and so that's reviewed by the professionals, and then decisions, the people in the unit are aware sort of how people are doing and if they're doing okay, and what services they need prior to them being reintegrated with their family. And that's generally how the process works. So they are given, they are given questions, psychological functioning questions.
Ну, я тут ще додам принагідно для аудиторії, що у нас був вебінар про декомпресію. То кому цікаво, будь ласка, дивіться на сторінках Форпост. Він вже розміщений і такий класний інформативний дуже вебінар був. Прошу, чи у слухачів є питання? Будь ласка. Так, я не бачу рук. Ми вже трішки вилізли за час, тому, Оля, давайте, щоб ми не перетримували і лекторів наших, і наших синхроністів золотих і брилянтових. Так.
Окей, дякую, я тоді продовжу. Є запитання щодо конкретних аспектів труднощів в подружніх стосунках. Запитують, як обходитись із зрадами. Чи є досвід, чи є поради в таких випадках?
So if there's, just to make sure I'm clear on the question, I think I missed part of it in terms of if there's conflict going on in the relationship. Did I get that right?
It's conflict and
Or if
betrayal.
there's infidelity. I see.
Infidelity.
I see.
Right.
Okay. Yes. Well, wow, that's a important question, because it happens sometimes. And I'm thinking back to different scenarios, or even with the writings, what I've read on it. So personal experience in terms of being in a deployed setting and that coming up, right? So I'm thinking about those experiences, and then from my reading and from learning about it as it relates to military couples. And it's a complicated topic, and it's not easy for anyone. And it's particularly difficult for the soldier when it occurs and they're still deployed, right? Depending on the timing of when they find out about the infidelity. So it can be very jarring for the service member, and on so many levels. And so what I would say about it, clinically, you would address it like you do any infidelity that occurs, or a break in trust that occurs in a relationship. in a marital relationship or a partnered, intimate partner relationship. In terms of clinically how you work with it, you work with it the same. What I would say is that the devastation is different because the person who is deployed, the soldier, is absolutely in a state of no matter how strong they are, war is beyond difficult. And so psychologically, they're so vulnerable anyway. And then if they have a betrayal and a betrayal of trust that which can be repaired, right? But sometimes it cannot be repaired. And so working through that clinically, like you would with any person, is definitely what's recommended. I would say just knowing people who've gone through that, that it's when the trust is just broken, right? It's a trust that's broken, and sometimes people are able to repair it. I will say, just kind of mentioning, got the Gottman's work, who they are well known, in particular in the United States. They have the Gottmans have a method, and I think their method for helping repair broken, basically infidelity, for example, but not only, any trusts that are broken in intimate relationships, in my opinion, clinically is the foremost best treatment protocols or skills that I know of. Even I think that it's incredibly helpful and useful work. So I'll mention the Gottman's work, and hopefully that's helpful. But it happens. And the last thing I'll just kind of say about it is that if you're working with someone who's had that level of, betrayal of trust, while they're going through and sacrificing and fighting in this war, do whatever you can to connect them to any other social support systems that they have, other family, hopefully, because it's extremely, it's an isolating experience. So certainly there could be, other people that have gone through the experience, potentially, that would be helpful if the person is willing and able to be even that more vulnerable. They may not be.
Rachel, for the sake of time, let me ask that we come to an end here.
Sure.
I'm going to ask you to post your email in the chat. And if there are any other questions that Rachel could answer, if you could send them to her. Or alternatively, Oksana, if you're willing to receive any questions that you could then forward to Rachel, that would be wonderful. Does that work for you, Oksana?
Super. This is the way we are going to do it. Then
Okay.
the questions that we have collected, we will translate them into English probably, and we will send them to Rachel, okay?
Wonderful.
I wanted to thank you. I wanted to say that this is the first experience that APA hosted us, and that was fantastic. Thank you for all the team who collaborated for this experience. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, James. And thank you, Karol. Thank you, Chris, also, and all the Ukrainian team as well. Thank for our interpreters. Please, God save you both. Thank you very
Wonderful.
much. Yes.
Rachel, again, thank you very much. This has been very informative and
Yes.
I think
Mhm.
helpful.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Karol. Thanks to everyone. Appreciate that.
Okay.
Yeah.
We
Have a good evening.